Alright folks, today I'm going to share with you a story that will send chills down your spine. We all know our beloved star, Chris Hemsworth, who captured our hearts as Thor. But what many don't know is that Chris once had a terrifying experience in an old Australian mansion. This is a true story, something he shared in the past, and today I'm bringing it to you in detail. It's hard to believe that someone like him, a superhero on screen, could have faced such frightening moments in real life. So, let's dive into Chris Hemsworth's chilling encounter. But before we begin, if you're new to my channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button because I'll be sharing more real and unbelievable stories like this. And hey, if you feel the fear creeping in during this story, don't forget to subscribe. It's the least you can do to brace yourself for what's coming. Now, Chris Hemsworth, being an Aussie at heart, has always felt a strong connection to his homeland. During one of his trips back to Australia, he decided to explore some of the country's older, lesser-known areas. That's when he stumbled upon the mansion, an eerie, ancient structure tucked away in a remote part of the countryside. This place wasn't just any old house. It had a strange, almost magnetic pull, as if it was hiding secrets waiting to be uncovered. Chris, being fascinated by history and architecture, was naturally intrigued. He had heard some whispers about the mansion's dark past, but like anyone else, he brushed them off as local folklore. A mansion this old would definitely have a few stories attached to it, right? So, Chris and his companions, maybe his family or close friends, decided to stay there for a few nights, thinking it would be a fun, rustic getaway. Little did they know, what started as a peaceful retreat would soon turn into one of the most unsettling experiences of his life. When Chris and his companions first arrived at the mansion, it felt like stepping back in time. The mansion stood tall, its stone walls covered in vines, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. The driveway was cracked, and the overgrown garden gave the place an abandoned, almost forgotten look. But there was something else, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. It wasn't just the age of the place or its isolated location, it was the air. The entire area felt unnaturally still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Chris noticed the massive wooden doors, weathered by time but still standing firm. As they pushed the doors open, a creak echoed through the mansion, as if the building was welcoming them, or perhaps warning them. Inside, the furniture was old but in surprisingly good condition. Faded portraits hung on the walls, their eyes seeming to follow them as they moved from room to room. A large staircase led up to the second floor, where dust covered everything like a blanket. For a moment, Chris was captivated by the sheer history of the place. It was exactly the kind of place he'd hoped to find, full of mystery, with stories embedded in every crack of the floorboards. But there was an uneasy feeling that started creeping in, the kind of feeling that made you constantly glance over your shoulder, even when you knew no one was there. And the mansion, it was silent. Too silent. There was no wind, no birds, no sounds from the outside world. Just the eerie quiet that seemed to grow louder the longer they stayed. Still, they set up their things, brushing off the discomfort as first-day jitters. After all, this was just an old mansion, nothing more. At least, that's what they kept telling themselves. It didn't take long for the strange occurrences to begin. On the very first night, as they were settling in, Chris noticed something odd. The lights in the hallway kept flickering, but only when no one was standing directly beneath them. He chalked it up to old wiring. It was an ancient mansion after all, but still, it made him uneasy. The others didn't seem to notice, or at least didn't mention it. Then came the sounds. At first, they were faint, like distant whispers just barely audible. Chris would be sitting in one of the old chairs, reading or talking with his companions, and suddenly he'd hear it. A low murmur, almost as if someone was having a conversation in the next room. But whenever he got up to check, the room would be completely empty. His friends laughed it off, saying the house was playing tricks on him. But Chris wasn't so sure. Later that night, when they all went to bed, the strange events continued. Around midnight, a cold draft swept through the house. Chris could feel it creeping under his door, even though all the windows were closed. It wasn't just a normal breeze. It felt like something unnatural, like the air itself had turned hostile, and with it came that same whispering, louder this time, as if it was coming from just outside his door. Chris lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. Was this all just his imagination? Was he letting the eerie atmosphere of the mansion get to him? He tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The mansion was waking up. The next evening, things took a darker turn. After a long day of exploring the grounds around the mansion, everyone was tired and decided to call it a night early. Chris, however, couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had been lingering since the moment they arrived. Something was off, and the mansion itself seemed to pulse with a quiet menace. Just as he was about to fall asleep, Chris heard footsteps in the hallway outside his room. At first, he thought it was one of his friends, maybe going to grab some water or check something, but the footsteps stopped right outside his door and stayed there. It was as if someone was standing on the other side, waiting. Chris held his breath, listening. He waited for the door to creak open or for the footsteps to move away, but nothing happened. Silence. Cautiously, he got out of bed and slowly walked toward the door. He hesitated for a moment before deciding to open it just a crack to take a look. The hallway was dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb, and at first, everything seemed normal. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow. A tall, dark figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't moving, just standing there, completely still. Chris blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but the shadow remained. Heart pounding, he opened the door wider and stepped into the hallway. The figure didn't move, but the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Chris stared at it, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He called out, "Hello?" hoping it was one of his friends playing a prank. But there was no response. The figure just stood there, silent, unmoving, like it was waiting for something. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow seemed to dissolve into the darkness, melting away like smoke. Chris stood frozen in place, his mind racing. Had he really seen it? Was it just his imagination? But deep down, he knew that shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. Something was there, watching them. And whatever it was only the beginning. After that night, sleep became impossible for Chris. Every time he closed his eyes, it felt like the mansion was closing in on him. The once quiet nights were now filled with strange, unsettling sounds. It started with the same footsteps he had heard in the hallway, but now they seemed to come from all directions. Above, below, sometimes right outside his door. It was like someone, or something, was constantly pacing through the house, but there was never anyone there. One night, around 2 a.m., Chris woke up suddenly, heart racing, his body covered in a cold sweat. He had been dreaming. No, more like trapped in a nightmare. In the dream, he was lying in bed, just like he was now, but there was a figure standing at the foot of the bed, staring at him. It didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him. He couldn't see its face, but he could feel its gaze, cold and unnerving. When he tried to move or scream, he realized he couldn't. He was paralyzed, trapped in his own body, unable to escape. When he finally snapped awake, he could still feel the weight of that figure's presence lingering in the room. His breathing was shallow, and for a moment he was convinced that if he looked down at the foot of his bed, he would see that same shadowy figure from his dream. But the room was empty. Still, the fear stayed with him, making it impossible to go back to sleep. This kept happening night after night. Chris started waking up at odd hours, each time feeling like he wasn't alone. He would hear faint knocking sounds, like someone tapping on the walls or doors, but when he got up to check, no one was there. Worse, sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night and feel a presence next to his bed, so close he could almost feel it breathing. His friends had started noticing the change in him. They joked about the haunted house at first, but Chris could see the fear in their eyes too. They were all having trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares or sudden feelings of dread that seemed to hang in the air. Something was wrong with this mansion, and whatever it was starting to seep into their minds, their dreams, making sleep a luxury none of them could afford. As the sleepless nights continued, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion was trying to tell him something. Determined to find answers, he decided to dig into its past. What exactly was this place, and why did it feel so alive? After a few calls to some locals and a bit of research, he discovered the mansion's dark history. The house was over a century old, originally built by a wealthy family who mysteriously disappeared one winter, leaving behind no trace. Locals spoke of strange occurrences ever since, a family cursed by their own secrets. There were stories of tragic deaths, people vanishing, and unexplained accidents, all tied to the mansion. But there was one story that stood out, a tale that made Chris's blood run cold. Decades ago, a man who had moved into the mansion began seeing things. His account was eerily similar to what Chris and his friends were experiencing now. The man had reported seeing shadows in the hallways, hearing whispers at night, and feeling an unseen presence watching him. According to the legend, the man was eventually found dead, his body positioned as though he had been trying to claw his way out of the house. The cause of death was never determined, but locals believed he had been driven mad by whatever haunted the mansion. The more Chris read, the more the pieces started falling into place. The whispers, the shadows, the sleepless nights, everything pointed back to the mansion's dark history. But what terrified him most was learning that every person who stayed there seemed to experience the same gradual descent into madness. Chris realized that what they were dealing with wasn't just some ordinary haunting. The mansion itself was alive, feeding off the fear of those who entered. And now it had its grip on them. With the mansion's dark history weighing heavily on his mind, Chris knew they couldn't just ignore what was happening anymore. The sleepless nights, the eerie shadows, the feeling of constantly being watched. It was all getting worse. They couldn't go on pretending these were just tricks of the mind. Something was here, and it wasn't going to stop until it made its presence fully known. One evening, after another restless night, Chris decided it was time to confront whatever was haunting the mansion. He couldn't take it anymore, and neither could his friends. So they all agreed to search the house, hoping to find some explanation. Anything that could give them answers. Armed with flashlights, they started their search, moving from room to room. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind sent chills down their spines, but they pressed on. As they reached the far end of the house, Chris noticed something strange. A door they hadn't seen before. It was tucked away behind a large old cabinet, almost like someone had hidden it on purpose. Chris's heart pounded as he pulled the cabinet aside, revealing the door more clearly. It was small, almost unnoticeable, and had no handle. The air around it felt heavier, colder, like stepping into a different space entirely. Without hesitation, Chris pushed the door open. Inside was a narrow, dark staircase leading downward. It smelled damp and musty, like the air hadn't moved there in years. His friends hesitated, but Chris, driven by a mix of fear and determination, descended the stairs. As they made their way down, the sense of dread grew stronger. They could hear faint, distant noises, like whispers echoing off the walls. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small, hidden room. The walls were covered in strange symbols and markings, and in the center of the room was an old, worn-out book, lying open on a table. Chris's hands trembled as he picked it up, realizing that whatever was happening in this house had been going on for much longer than any of them had imagined. They had confronted the unknown, and what they found was far worse than anything they could have expected. As Chris stood in the eerie room, staring at the strange markings in the old book, a chill ran down his spine. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the very walls of the mansion were closing in on them. His friends stood behind him, silent, their faces pale with fear. It was clear now, they were no longer alone. Whatever had been haunting the mansion was with them, and it was watching. Suddenly, the faint whispers they had been hearing for days grew louder, echoing around the room. It wasn't coming from outside or the hallway this time. It was here, with them, in this very room. Chris's heart raced, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His flashlight flickered as the temperature in the room dropped even more. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. Something moving in the shadows. At first, it was just a dark blur, but as Chris turned to face it, the shape began to take form. A tall, dark figure emerged from the far corner of the room. Its face was obscured by darkness, but its presence was overpowering, like a thick cloud of fear washing over them. The room felt like it was spinning, the air vibrating with an unnatural energy. Chris tried to speak, to call out to his friends, but no sound came. His throat felt tight, as though the entity was draining the very life out of him. The figure didn't move closer, but Chris could feel its eyes, empty, soulless, fixed on him. The whispers grew louder and more chaotic, filling his head with a cacophony of voices, none of them making any sense, but all of them full of malice. Suddenly, the figure shifted, gliding toward them without a sound. Chris's friends backed away, panic spreading through the group. But Chris couldn't move. He was frozen, trapped in the entity's gaze. Time seemed to slow as the figure stopped just a few feet away, its presence overwhelming. It felt like the weight of all the mansion's history, all its pain and darkness was pressing down on him. In that moment, Chris realized the truth. This was no ordinary ghost or spirit. It was the embodiment of the mansion itself, a manifestation of everything that had ever gone wrong within its walls. And now, it had come for them. In that moment of pure terror, Chris knew they had to get out of the mansion. The figure looming in front of them wasn't going to let them stay any longer. Gathering every bit of strength he had left, Chris shouted, "Run!" His voice cracked, but it was enough to snap his friends out of their frozen state. Without hesitation, they bolted for the staircase, their footsteps echoing loudly through the narrow stone hallway. As they scrambled up the stairs, the air around them seemed to close in, growing heavier with each step. The whispers were deafening now, like 100 voices all screaming at once. Chris could feel the entity following them, its presence creeping up behind them, faster than they could run. His legs burned with exhaustion, but adrenaline kept him moving. They reached the top of the stairs, bursting through the hidden door back into the main hallway. The mansion itself seemed to come alive, as if it were fighting to keep them trapped. The walls groaned, and the floorboards creaked as though they might collapse beneath their feet. The lights flickered violently, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around them. Chris didn't dare look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the entity's cold breath on the back of his neck, pushing them to move faster. They raced toward the front door, but when they reached it, the door wouldn't budge. Chris and his friends pushed with all their strength, panic surging through them as the entity's presence closed in. Just when it felt like all hope was lost, the door flew open with a loud crash, as if the mansion itself had relented in its final attempt to hold them. They stumbled outside into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The silence that followed was suffocating. The mansion stood behind them, dark and still, its windows staring back at them like empty eyes. The oppressive presence that had been chasing them vanished the moment they crossed the threshold. But they all knew it was still there, lurking, waiting for its next victim. Without a word, they hurried away, leaving the haunted mansion behind, knowing they had barely escaped with their lives. In the days following their escape, Chris and his friends were haunted by what had happened. Though they were physically out of the mansion, the memories of that night clung to them like a dark cloud. None of them spoke much about it. How could they? The experience was so far beyond anything rational, anything they could easily explain. Each of them was left wondering if they had truly encountered something supernatural, or if the mansion had simply played tricks on their minds. Chris, however, couldn't let it go. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadowy figure, felt its icy breath, and heard those terrible whispers. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, always interrupted by nightmares of being trapped in that cursed house. His friends tried to move on, returning to their normal lives, but for Chris, it was impossible to forget. The fear had followed him, creeping into every corner of his life. He began researching the mansion even more deeply, desperate for answers. He spoke with historians, paranormal experts, and even skeptics, trying to understand what they had experienced. What he discovered only made things worse. The mansion had a long history of visitors reporting strange phenomena, and several had vanished without a trace over the years. It wasn't just the family who originally lived there. It was anyone who stayed too long, anyone who got too close. They had all either disappeared or left changed, marked by whatever evil resided within those walls. As time passed, Chris and his friends stopped talking altogether about the incident. It became the unspoken rule, don't mention the mansion. They went their separate ways, each trying to bury the fear in their own way, but Chris knew, deep down, that the mansion had left its mark on them. It wasn't something you could walk away from, not fully. The entity, the house, it had taken a part of them that night, a part they'd never get back. Chris tried to move forward, but in the back of his mind, one thought always lingered. The mansion was still there, waiting, watching, and as long as it stood, no one who entered would ever truly be free from its grip. Looking back on that terrifying experience, Chris realized that some places are meant to remain untouched, their secrets buried in the past. The mansion was one of those places, an entity in itself, feeding off the fear and lives of those who dared to enter. It was more than just haunted. It was a trap, a living, breathing force of darkness that consumed everything in its path. As a YouTuber retelling Chris Hemsworth's chilling encounter, I can't help but wonder what drives people into the unknown. Curiosity? Adventure? Perhaps it's the thrill of facing something we don't fully understand. But after hearing Chris's story, one thing is clear. There are some doors best left unopened, and some mysteries better left unsolved. If you ever find yourself drawn to an old, abandoned mansion, or any place with a dark past, remember this story. It's a warning, a reminder that not everything is meant to be explored. Some things are better left in the shadows. Stay curious, but stay safe. You never know what's lurking in the darkness, watching, waiting. And with that said, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more like it. Stay tuned, and remember, some mysteries should remain a mystery.